So I'm going to keep this conversation super developer facing, right? So the two ways are like pretty straightforward actually, a little tongue in cheek, but the first way to get started and start making a lot of money in crypto is build something useful, right? I think that's what all of you here for, trying to build something interesting. Because the opportunity space is so large that even if you make something that is even a little bit useful, I think there is a lot of value to capture, right? Like very small tools, very small improvements, dev tooling, stuff like that. If you build, huge scope for that. Polygon in particular is very aggressive. They give out a lot of grants, so it's easy for you folks to go get a grant and start building something really useful. But I'll also shamelessly plug my own company here, Questbook, which helps you get more grants. So please feel free to check out questbook.app. That's the only shield that I'm going to give you. But the more interesting part is the second way to make money, right? The second way to make money is buy a lot of crypto and bring in smart developers into the space. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Right. So yeah. So I myself am a developer, and the way that I approach my code, right? Whenever I look at the code that I've written, they broadly fall into three buckets. And the three buckets are, the first is open source code. Like I use a lot of open source code. I probably copy paste from various GitHub repositories. I use a bunch of open source libraries and stuff like that. So that's the first bucket, right? Which is open sourced code that I just copy paste in some sense. The second category that I would put my code in is me calling services and APIs. There's a bunch of APIs that are already available. Can I like call them so that I don't have to write everything from scratch? And that is the second large piece of my code. And the third piece of code is that of just putting all of this together, right? Like the duct tape, the glue, whatever you want to call it, my own business logic in which I write something actually productive. That probably is the smallest part of my code base. In the sense, I'm writing very little piece of code, but I'm like using other services, other APIs, other open source material to get a product out. So now I want to analyze how these three buckets actually play out and what is the relevance in the context of Web3. And I'm going to give you a case on why Web3 matters from a very developer-facing standpoint. And that is what I want you to take away. First of all, when you're trying to convince yourself, am I in the right space? Why am I building in crypto? Why crypto in the first place? All of that. So I want to give you some ammunition to go through that thought process and consolidate your own mental models around it. And secondly, when you're talking to other developers in this space, like how are you trying to convince them, right? Like we keep hearing about all of this ownership economy. You keep hearing about institutions are bad and stuff like that. But as far as my experience has gone, it's never been convincing to the other person when I'm giving such logic, right? Like I'm saying, hey, institutions are bad. That's why we need crypto. And like, not really. Most of the institutions that I deal with seem to be all right. So I don't really have the problem. So why crypto? Why are we doing all of this? And we're going to argue from a very developer-facing standpoint. Right. So now, if you look at the three buckets of code that we typically tend to be writing, the first bucket of code is open source code. Right. So that is largely credited to GitHub and all the open source movement that came before it. We don't have to reinvent pieces of the stack. Right. So we can just reuse the existing libraries. We can go copy paste stuff from existing repositories. And what that does is you don't have to reinvent pieces of the stack. You can build on top of things that people have already built, right? For example, I don't write HTTP requests anymore. I typically end up using some library like Axios or something, right, on JavaScript. So instead of having to write those HTTP requests from scratch, I'm using something that's already been built. Great. So what that really enabled, in my opinion, is that it fast-forwarded digital innovation. Right? So now every minute that we are spending and not having to write low-level HTTP requests, I can now build innovation on top of things that have already been invented. I don't need to reinvent the wheel. So we are fast-forwarding digital innovation. And that brings me to the second large bucket, that is that of APIs and services that we call. This also has this similar flavor, right? Like in this sense, if you're using APIs and services, you're again not reinventing the wheel. You're just reusing some weather data or Google Map API or something like that, and you're like just building on top of it. So you're fast forwarding innovation over there by not having to reinvent that stack. You don't have to send a satellite to get weather data for your app. You can just use weather.com, right? So that's interesting. Now, what I argue in the context of APIs is what I think the core essence of Web3 is from the perspective of a developer. If open source code fast forwarded digital innovation in one axis, I think what Web3 is doing is it is open sourcing hosting, right? So now every service is always going to be open sourced. And that is a huge innovation. Let me tell you why. There are two very critical aspects of writing any code in Web3. That is, it is composable and it is trustless. I don't want to bug you with the jargon, but let's go deeper. Right, so any piece of code that is deployed in crypto, right? So by default has open APIs, and by default other people can build on top of it. And at the same time, you don't have to trust that particular piece of code. Now, what does that imply? Like, what is the parallel from the Web 2 world? In the Web 2 world, first of all, APIs are an afterthought for most of the companies out there. Like you take Twitter, you take Facebook, LinkedIn, whatever. Many years after their launch is when they open up their APIs. That's problem number one. Problem number two is if you want to build on top of Twitter, you want to build on top of Facebook, you can build it. Like now they have trust. Like Facebook is large enough that I can trust them that they won't do anything stupid, but they still do. But anyways, let's assume that we are okay with that level of trust. We are okay that hey, these people are large enough. I trust them. Great. But what are the companies that we trust? Will you trust a company that's like a few weeks old? Maybe not, right? So that is another problem. These are two problems. First of all, the APIs get launched like several years after the product itself is launched. So you cannot build on top of Twitter until, well, Twitter opens up its APIs. And the second is you have to wait till you see some kind of proof that this is a trustworthy company before you start building your own company on top of it. As for example, Zynga probably built their games on top of Facebook only because like Facebook was large enough, like there was enough trust. So I think because of both of these problems, that you have to wait for the APIs to be launched, you have to wait for a trust to be built, the rate of digital innovation is being curtailed, right? So now contrast this with the Web3 world. Now this project called the Loot project, right? So the Loot project launched was like a silly NFT project, probably somebody's weekend project, and immediately after that Loot project launched, there are hundreds of companies that got built on top of Loot project, right? So there is Adventure Gold, there is Bandit Gold, and a bunch of others who have millions of dollars in market value cap. So their entire business is built on top of Loot project, and they didn't have to wait for Loot project to open up their APIs. They didn't have to wait for Loot project to become trustworthy. On day one, it is open APIs. On day one, it is trustworthy. I think that is the core essence of what Web3 brings from the developer's perspective. That anything that is out there, you can start building on top of it without having to wait for APIs to be launched or trust to be built. Other great examples for this is, of course, Uniswap. Uniswap has been around for a little while longer, of course, but you don't need anybody's permission. You don't need Uniswap to open up certain APIs. The day that they launched Uniswap v3, all their APIs were public. Like anybody could start building on top of it. You could build some concentrated liquidity kind of dApps the moment Uniswap launched v3, right? So you don't have to wait for dApps to build trust. You don't have to wait for them to launch their APIs. And that is something that is super, super powerful, which in my opinion, fast forwards digital innovation even further from what open source code did. Right, so and that brings me to the last bucket, which is that of code that I write myself. And as a consequence of what I just mentioned, the code that I write also is going to be by default public, in the sense that the moment I write my code, the moment I deploy my code, anything that is on the chain can be built upon. So my APIs are going to be public on day zero itself. So the way that I look at Web3 from a very developer-facing perspective is it's a great technology for us to be able to fast forward digital innovation. That's why I am here. Personally, that is what excites me, because Web3 is able to accelerate digital innovation. Now today, probably only in the context of Web3 itself, like probably innovation is happening around DeFi, NFTs, maybe AMM, stuff like that. But I think the power that Web3 has is it is able to fast forward digital innovation that is not only confined to Web3, but the entire digital realm itself. For example, like if there is an ML model, could there be collaboration on the models that had happened earlier? So could we have had self-driving cars faster? Could we have had OpenAI build GPT-3 faster? So stuff like that. So that's the kind of innovation that will be possible because we'll be able to front run the inefficiencies that exist in the Web 2 world, because of which we have to wait for several years before you can build on top of somebody else's innovation. I think that, in my opinion, is something that is super, super powerful. That's what I'm here for. And that is what I appeal to all of you as well, is build on top of technologies and provide other people to be able to build on top of yours. And that is how you have to be thinking about stuff that you build in Web3. I think that brings me to the end of like what are the mental models to be using, but also I want to point out a few mistakes that a lot of developers make. So if you look at building in Web3 from the perspective of being able to fast forward digital innovation, a lot of people in the space seem to be making the mistake of writing Web2 code in Solidity. What I mean by that is you're just taking what you could have written in JavaScript and just writing it in Solidity and calling it decentralized. It's the worst of both worlds. It's the worst of both worlds in the sense, well, Solidity is not a super powerful language, so you're having all those constraints, and at the same time, it's also expensive to run those things on chain. So you have to think about building decentralized software in a very different perspective. You have to think about being composable on day one. Like on day one, you have to think about, hey, how will I become successful when more people build on top of my product? I think that is the core essence, in my opinion, of Web3. And then the second that comes with it is how do you make sure you're trustless? Trustless in the sense that whatever code I'm writing, I do not have to uh, depend on my own goodwill for other people to be able to use my product. I think these are like two themes that I, as a developer, try to think about again and again and again. I still make the mistakes of not being composable, of not being trustless while I'm writing code in Web3. And that's something that I wanted to alert you in this like super short talk. But yeah, happy to take questions from this point on. I know it's a very abstract topic that we talked about. So, like, any questions, not just related to this topic, happy to take. What were the two ways? The first way is build something interesting. The second way is buy a lot of ETH, Matic, whatever you want, and just bring more developers into the space. Yeah, sure. Like I don't want this to become a shell, but since you asked the question, I'll go through it. So Questbook is essentially a way to connect grants with grantees. Like Polygon, for example, is running their grant program on Questbook, and that entire product is completely decentralized in the sense that we don't run our own servers, we don't run our own databases. Everything is either on chain or on decentralized storage. So what that enables is there are a bunch of people who have started building tools on top of Questbook for discovery. Somebody's built a discovery tool. Somebody's built a so in our product, like whenever a grant application comes in, it goes through a review process. So there's somebody who has made the review process a little bit better. So yeah, so Questbook itself is an app where you can go to just questbook.xyz. You can find a lot of grant programs that are running their grant programs and like apply to them. I would really encourage you to go apply for, especially Polygon's grant program. It's a very active grant program. People are super responsive, and especially stuff that you build here in the Hacker House today will be a great candidate to go apply for a grant as well. So I do encourage, if you are like serious about the stuff that you're building, um, you should definitely consider getting a grant from the ecosystem.
That was a very interesting talk. So I want to ask your opinions on sharding, right? Which makes composability a little more complicated. So what do you think about that? Because one of the main reasons you think Web3, and I also think Web3 is amazing because of just the composability which is available. You can call any contract out of the box. Some things like cross blockchain composability, one, and second, like after sharding, how will it get more complicated?
Um, okay, so there are two parts to this answer. So, are you asking this question in the context of Ethereum or
So the sharding is in context of Ethereum, cross
got it?
blockchain is more general.
So the problem that you're referring to existed till some time back, but I don't think that exists anymore because um, Ethereum itself and its roadmap has moved away from the execution sharding to more of a data sharding kind of a roadmap future. So I think the sharding problem that you're referring to existed before the move to something like prototype sharding and stuff like that. So yeah, that problem, however, does exist in near. They are handling it in a completely different way, which also loops back to your other part of the question, which is how does inter blockchain kind of communication happen? I think that is a huge opportunity right now in the space to enable cross chain. No, so right now, most of the bridges that we are seeing seem to be asset transfer. Like you can transfer ERC20 tokens from one chain to the other, or probably NFTs as well. But can we call contracts? Can we do information exchange? I think those kind of that's a really interesting opportunity. I also heard Mudud also talk about bridges and the security issues around it. I think it's a great time to be investigating into how to enable this cross chain. I think it's very early, so I do not think we've solved that problem yet. Um, but yeah, I do not have a good answer. How are we going to solve for this? It's definitely um, a problem that, hey, if we are building on Arbitrum and on Polygon, how are these things going to talk to each other? I think that piece of infrastructure will, in my opinion, almost definitely get built. It's just a question of who builds it. This also brings me kind of to a cheeky definition of an entrepreneur. The entrepreneur, the entrepreneur's job is to not just question the status quo, but it is to fast forward what is inevitable, right? So in my opinion, this falls into that category. Like these cross chain bridges are inevitable, and builders over here, entrepreneurs over here, their job is to fast forward our journey to that inevitable end. So like if you're a builder looking for things to build, I would definitely look at cross chain bridges at this point.